But of course, one of the problems is by 1942, the Red Army is not going to be taken by surprise. They've learned how to fight. They learned how to organize. If they are not yet as powerful as the Germans, if they haven't mastered the arts of blitzkrieg like the Germans, they're learning, and they're getting close, and they're formidable. Okay? It's ready. It's ready for them. They won't have the advantage of surprise here. Red Army officers prior to Barbarossa had been promoted for their kind of political reliability, right? Now they're promoted for their merit. They're promoted for their ability to get things done. And they're infused with the patriotic spirit that wasn't there a year earlier. By this point, all those factories that we moved to the east are starting to come online. And they're starting to produce massive amounts of war material for the Soviets. And they're not just producing more material, they're producing superior material to what they had in 1941. They're producing the latest designs and incorporating lessons that we've learned fighting the Germans in the last year. And not only are they producing, in many cases, because they're producing this new kind of state-of-the-art equipment with the Russians, the Germans are still kind of doing the same thing. The Germans have the most state-of-the-art, technically advanced military equipment at the beginning of the war. But over the course of the war, they're starting to lose that edge. They're starting to lose that edge. So it's a rapid German advance. It's a rapid German advance. And Stalin begins now to become a little more flexible at the urging of his generals in allowing for withdrawals. He understands if he tells his guys to hold, the Germans just surround him and they're destroyed. So he becomes a little more liberal in his allowing Soviet unions to withdraw. In one case, he allows an entire army group to fall back into the Caucasus Mountains so that it's not surrounded and destroyed. But his attitude, critically, Stalin's attitude during this offensive is quite a bit different than it was a year earlier. He begins much more to listen to his generals. You know, I suspect, and I don't want to play armchair psychiatrist here, but I suspect Stalin had kind of gotten used to just getting his own way on everything. And I think this is a problem dictators have, and I think it goes a long way to informing us about what's happening with Putin right now in Russia, in that if you surround yourself by yes men, there's just certain things you expect and certain things happen. And when they don't happen the way they do, I think there's just this psychological disconnect. For so long, everything's been going my way. How is this not going my way? And so Stalin's, I think, starting to come out of that. I think he's starting to have a more realistic appraisal about what his forces can do and what the dangers here are. If you are going to withdraw, you need permission from the top. If you withdraw without permission, it's a problem. And to that end, they have Order 227, which is another not one step back order, Order 227. It is there to prevent unauthorized retreats. Now, also, too, the Soviets create what they call blocking detachments. Blocking detachments. And what the job of a blocking detachment is they are units, usually NKVD, but sometimes Red Army units, that would be, their job was not to fight the Germans. Their job was to be behind the Soviet forces. And if these Russian soldiers start withdrawing, the job of the blocking units was to shoot their own soldiers. So the idea is, if we're facing the Germans, we may die, but if we go back, we will die, right? And that's the theory here they're trying to instill in many of these Soviet units. Now, they have been used far more in 41, but they're still in use in 42 here. You have a fairly liberal use of penal units here. Meaning you have Soviet soldiers who are arrested for, could be something like desertion, could be even, they could be stealing something from somebody else. I mean, essentially Soviet criminals within the army. Well, what they do is they take these guys, instead of just putting them under lock and key in the back and having to guard them, you organize them into a unit. And then you push this unit right at the Germans. And these penal units they're sent to the most dangerous sectors, right? They do the most dangerous jobs. And so even as Stalin is allowing some of these larger formations to pull back with permission, a lot of the actual frontline soldiers, I mean, it's still, you try to pull back, you withdraw, and there's some pretty devastating penalties, okay? So Stalin's becoming fairly liberal in some areas, but he's still very rigid in others here. Now, in August of 42, the Germans cross into the Caucasus Mountains, here in southern Russia. But as you can see, they're never able to penetrate all the way to the other side. They never can completely cut the Caucasus off from the rest of Russia. They're just not that strong. The Soviets, and when you do mountain fighting is a different kind of warfare because it creates, the mountains will create natural kind of sieves, right, and bottlenecks in the passes. You got to fight through those passes. Again, that's what we saw at Kasserine, right, in North Africa. So you create these passes here. And the Soviets are very good at defending them. Now remember when the Soviet army attacked Finland? The Finns were doing the same thing through the lakes, right? The Soviets are doing this here in the Caucasus Mountains. They're able to defend these quite well. And so by about this point, August of 42, it becomes obvious the Wehrmacht will not take the oil fields of the Caucasus. They just don't have the strength to get through the mountains and take the oil fields there. So that means by the end of the summer, the main strategic objective of the operation cannot be fulfilled. They cannot take the oil fields. But there's still even after this, the biggest battle of the campaign is yet to be fought. So there was one, I think Speer mentions this in his memoirs, there was one instance where the soldiers here who actually get to the Caucasus Mountains, they send a message back to Berlin, essentially saying that among the soldiers there were some mountaineers. Mountain climbing was a big recreational thing in Germany. And some of these guys actually climbed the tallest mountain in the Caucasus, and they put the swastika flag. And of course, they're thinking it's this great propaganda boon. Well, they sent this back to Hitler, and Hitler went into a rage. He's like, "We're fighting a war, and you guys are off, doing some recreational activity, So he was actually pretty upset about it, but, it was kind of too late to do anything about it. But like I say, one of the reasons why the Soviets are not completely broken here like they were, I mean, you're still having formations destroyed, but not like they were in 41. Again, is because you got this large scale, as I mentioned, large scale withdrawals. The Soviets are improving their tactics, and not just their armies, they're improving their air forces. We also now know one of the big things they're going to start doing in 42, they weren't doing in 41. They are following what Tukhachevsky would have recommended. They're concentrating their armor. Remember, they had dispersed their armor, their tanks, among the army. The Germans, the way they're winning victories is concentrating armor, right? The Soviets were still looking at armor, contrary to what Tukhachevsky had preached. They're looking at Soviet armor as infantry support, just infantry support, right? Germans weren't looking at armor as infantry support. If anything, the infantry was supporting the armor, They start shaking that up. They start concentrating their armor here, and they actually create armored divisions along the lines of the Germans here. They also, see if I got it here, the Katyusha rocket launcher. The CAD or the Caddy, sometimes it was called. Now, as I mentioned, the one thing the Russians were always really good at, going back to Napoleon and before, the one field the Russians were really good at was artillery. They knew how to use artillery. They always knew how to use artillery. But the problem is, you need, in this kind of warfare, you need it fast, you need it mobile. So you see these Katyusha rocket launchers, which, as you can see, are not terribly complex to build, and they mount them on these trucks, and then you just got these rockets there, and they launch these things. And if you've ever seen any footage and you hear the sound, they make this scream. It's almost like a Stuka dive bomber, but they make these screams when they're launching here. And the Germans, because they make this noise, this scream, the Germans begin to call them Stalin's organs. Stalin's organs, like he's playing the organ. It's not a terribly accurate form of artillery. It's not particularly accurate. They're not like a modern missile. They don't have guidance systems or anything like that, right? It's not accurate, but it's powerful enough that if it even gets in the vicinity of where it's going to hit, it's going to do damage. It's going to do damage. And again, with the scream, it's got that kind of psychological effect that the Stukas did. by 1942, by about mid-1942, they really start coming into service. You start to see a lot of these things. And then by the end of the year, by the end of 42, like I say, Soviet industry is now recovering from the evacuation, and it's really starting to produce. So Soviet industry is really starting to produce by the end of 1942. Now again, too, most of the tanks the Soviets were employing in 41, they had a few really good tanks like the T-34, but most of the tanks that the Soviets had were these old, outdated, light, really tanks to be infantry support, right? That some of them didn't even have like big guns, just maybe machine guns or something, right? And now here again in 42, we're starting to see T-34s and the KVs coming out in much greater numbers here at this point. That's a T-34. It kind of shows you where they're storing ammunition, the driver, the machine gun there, the turret. That, like I said, this is the T-34. Heinz Guderian called this the greatest tank of the war. The German, Heinz Guderian, the German officer, said this is the greatest tank of the war. And they were. And one of the things that made them so great was, the Germans were always too clever by half. And they were always trying to make all these innovations and stuff like that. And what makes the T-34 so good is it's a relatively simple design. It was simple to maintain. It was simple to use. And that's going to be one of the reasons why it's such a workhorse, and they produce so many of them. And again, it goes back to that statement by Stalin that quantity is its own quality, right? And it's going to be the same. It's going to be true of the Sherman, the United States tank, the Sherman. T-34 is a better tank than the Sherman, but I mean, the Sherman was mass-produced. It was ubiquitous. You could use it for all sorts of things. They would constantly make sensible modifications to it that worked. So it was a great tank there. As we also know, women, more and more women in the Red Army are joining up, and they're being used effectively in a lot of cases. Not always. Women are also effectively used as snipers. They also train a lot of women as snipers, and women are very effective as snipers here. But again, as I say, you got over 1 million women serving in the Red Army over the course of the war. They also do tank crews. You have nurses, communications, intelligence, all across the board. They have good roles. It's funny. There's a film that came out in, I think it was the late 90s. It was not long after the Soviet Union collapsed, and it was called Burnt by the Sun. Have you seen it? No. Has anybody seen it? Burnt by the Sun? It's a Russian film. Great film. And it's about this Red Army officer during the purges. But what it is he goes to a dacha with his family to have this big celebration one weekend. While he's there, he's an older guy. He's probably in his 50s. And his wife's quite a bit younger. She's like in her 20s. And they have this little girl. The girl is just absolutely adorable. And they go to this dacha. While they're at this dacha, this like stranger just shows up, but it turns out it's his wife's old lover. And it turns out he's with the NKVD. And he's actually there to arrest the husband in the purges, right? And there's a scene. Oh, it's a beautiful film. There's a scene where the little girl always sings this little song, and he loves this little girl so much. She's just the pride of his life, and she sings this song. And he, in the film, at the very end, the NKVD arrests him, and he's like, F you guys, fine, I'll go with you. And he's in a car, and he's just there. He's just tough, and he's just practically gets in a fist fight. And the NKVD guys just beat the living hell out of him. He's just like, screw you guys. Just got this attitude. And then the NKVD guy that came to the dacha just turns around and he starts singing that song the little girl sings. And the guy just breaks down and cries. And it's heartbreaking. And anyway, he subsequently made a sequel that was not very good. But the sequel was that I mean, because the end of the film is kind of, this guy's going to die. The guy's going to be killed, right? But in the sequel, he was just in a gulag, and he comes back and he fights in the war. And his daughter is now like a tank driver in the war. And it had some interesting stuff in it, but it wasn't nearly as good. But the guy that made it, it was his real-life daughter. He cast his the guy that made it is the main general, the general character, and the daughter is his daughter in real life. And they actually won an Academy Award. And if you go on, you look up the Academy Award, she comes up there, and she's just smiling, doesn't speak any English. Anyway, it was great. The guy, however, the guy's kind of a jerk because he's like a big-time Putin supporter, and he made, the problem is, he made that first film, which was such an indictment of the Stalinist system, And then the second film is kind of this rah-rah Russia. You know, it's this big nationalist thing. It kind of almost makes you think, well, Stalin wasn't so bad. So it kind of ruined it. But anyway, that was a big diversion because I wanted to talk about women in the Red Army. Oh, well. Okay. Seriously, Burnt by the Sun. If you get a chance, see it. It's a great film. There was one group called the Night Witches. And the Night Witches were fighter pilots, fighter and bomber pilots, but they're flying practically World War I era planes. They didn't want to give them... There's still a chauvinism there. They don't want to give these women modern planes. They don't think they can do with them. But so what these women would do is their tactics, because they would be so outclassed by Messerschmitts, they'd only fly at night when it's easier to escape. And essentially what they would do is they would fly over German formations and just strafe them and drop bombs. And these are not big, powerful planes, right? But they do damage, and again, they cause enough problems that the Germans come to fear the Night Witches. And when some of them get shot down, the Germans will just tear these women apart because of what they're doing. They hate them so much. Now, a lot of, we talked about a lot of the problems in the Soviet Union. The war on the kulaks, the collectivization, yada, yada. That takes place, of course, obviously in the countryside. So Russia's urban population tends to be much more patriotic and much more supporting the war. So you see a lot more people from the cities, join up here. And there's this, of course, belief among most Soviet citizens, we've all got to do our part. So now, by the end of the summer offensive, the Germans are stretched from Leningrad in the north all the way to the Ukraine. So they are just completely stretched out. Now here's the thing, because they have to hold that whole front, they don't have reserves. If there's a problem anywhere, they're kind of screwed, right? They're stretched so thin.